Hi, Epic Recaps here, and today I am going to explain to you a 2017 sci-fi thriller titled 222. If you want to be spoiled, keep watching. The film opens, and follows a faceless man to Grand Central Station, where he pulls out a gun, and approaches a woman, gently caressing her belly. A conductor is heard announcing the arrival of the 32 train to Millhurst, and turning around, he raises the gun at an approaching man who is also wielding a gun. The scene pans to the clock that now reads 2:22 and 3 gunshots are heard amidst screaming. A man named Dylan Branson awakens from his nightmare when his alarm goes off. Going about his morning routine, a newscast is heard in the background, reporting on a light from a star called Hamlin, which died out 30 years ago, is now only reaching the Earth, and that this supernova will have effects on the Earth and its inhabitants. Leaving for work, Dylan rides his bike to Grand Central Station and hops on the train to the airport, where he works as an air traffic controller. Possessing a unique ability to visualize patterns, Dylan manages to keep order at the control tower effortlessly, with the never-ending rotation of arriving and departing aircrafts. Later that evening, he goes to a bar with his coworkers to celebrate his 30th birthday, and receives a ticket to an aerial ballet as a gift. Lamenting that he has no one to go with, she assures him that his perfect someone will appear one day, and he looks towards a twinkling star. In the days that follow, Dylan is shown to follow the same routine every day, describing his love for patterns and predictability. On his way to work one day, he almost runs a man over on his bike, which gives him a moment's pause. Arriving to the tower, it's a busy day in the air, and the lead controller tries to rally the team. On an aircraft up above, a girl named Sarah gazes out the window as crewmates prepare the passengers for landing. Back at the tower, Dylan coordinates the aircraft's landing while simultaneously giving his go-ahead for another flight to depart. When the clock turns 2:22 p.m., he begins to see patterns emerge, indicating an imminent collision. He sees flashes of his Grand Central Station nightmare and is snapped out of his dream state by his superior, who asks if he held the landing plane back. Panic ensues in the tower and the pilots are unable to get a clear answer on whether to land or not. Dylan has a vision of the planes colliding and jumping into action. He gives the pilot permission to land, while telling the other aircraft to push it into the air. His team looks on in disbelief, as does Sarah, and the two aircrafts manage to avoid a mid-air collision. Afterward, looking at the clock, he's unable to comprehend what just happened. Called to meet with his superior, she goes over his file and notes that he graduated top of his class at pilot school. Dylan tells her he aced the test because he saw patterns in the questions, and she looks at him skeptically, telling him he's been suspended for 4 weeks pending a board review. When he bumps into his coworker, he shamefully tells them the suspension should have been longer, seeing as he almost killed 900 passengers. The next day, Dylan makes his way to the ballet show alone, and on the way there, he's distracted by an overhead plane, and is almost run over. Walking through Grand Central Station, the arrival of Train 32 is announced as Dylan looks up and sees a constellation pattern that erupts, breaking panels of glass up top. He's unsure what to make of it when he sees the clock read 2:22. Arriving at the theater, Dylan takes his seat in the front row and notices a beautiful girl making her way down the row of seats. The girl turns out to be Sarah, and she's attending the show alone as well. The two share looks throughout the show, and he approaches her afterward at the bar. Catching her off guard, the pair hit it off and suggesting they have drinks at a more low-key bar. Over dinner, he shares that he's afraid to fly and became a traffic controller instead. Sarah tells him that she was an aspiring dancer, but after an injury, she now works at an art gallery. As the evening wears on, Dylan confesses that he nearly killed 900 people. When Sarah realizes that he is referring to her flight, Dylan laments that he almost killed her, which surprises her, insisting that he saved her instead. When they look to order another drink, the server tells them the restaurant closed an hour ago. Walking her to a cab, they admit to each other that for a first date, they felt a deep connection and it felt like they had known each other forever. Making his way home, Dylan can't help but smile to himself. At work the following day, Sarah is unable to contain her glow from the previous night. When an artist named Jonas comments on it, she tells him the ballet was beautiful, and doesn't notice the irked look on his face. Elsewhere, Dylan prepares to leave his home, but is unable to find his wallet. Just then his phone rings, and the woman on the line asks for Dylan Branson. In the same moment, he hears wheels squealing, and he looks out to see a cyclist has been hit below. Returning to the call, she tells him his wallet was found on a train last night and to pick it up at the station. Checking its contents, Dylan stops when he hears the repeated arrival of the 32 train heading to Millhurst. Looking around, a familiar scene plays out and he sees a businessman reading his newspaper, a couple hugging each other, a line of preschoolers where the last child in line drops something, and a pregnant woman under the clock. Dylan looks up at the departure board, and when the lights begin to flicker, he looks at the clock, which begins to spark at exactly 2:22, followed by screams. He later shows up at the gallery and asks Sarah out to dinner. When she hints that it's a bit early, they laugh at his eagerness and share a bite in Central Park. When Sarah mentions the injury that kept her from pursuing her dream, he makes an improvised speaker and the two dance, sharing a tender moment that leads to lovemaking back at his apartment. The next morning, Dylan notices Sarah's necklace and learns that it was a birthday gift from her ex-boyfriend, who turns out to be Jonas. Laughing at the irony, he inquires about her birth date and both are in disbelief when she says April 18, 1986, the same as his. A week away, Dylan states they're both turning 30 and is interrupted by a collision downstairs. He returns to Sarah and looking at his watch, he mentions that it's the third day in a row he's witnessed a similar incident. Later at the gallery, when Jonas mentions that she smells nice, their colleague comments it's pheromones, hinting that she's in love. When Jonas questions her, Sarah doesn't deny it, which leads to an awkward moment when Jonas looks at her longingly. Meanwhile, Dylan takes a cab to the train station and is at the mercy of a reckless driver who takes him on an alternate route. When Dylan notices the same pattern of sounds that's been haunting him, he shouts for the cab to stop. This infuriates the driver, who turns around to tell Dylan off for shouting at him. Just then, another car hits them both, causing the inevitable sound of breaking glass and loud screaming from nearby witnesses. Even though Dylan is injured, he makes his way to the station, and all the while sees the exact same pattern of events. When he arrives at Sarah's, he tells her of these repeating noise patterns that play out but with different people carrying out the same actions. Not sure what to make of his tale, she holds him in her arms. Dylan goes home and starts writing down all the events of his day starting from 9:10 a.m., and realizes that every day is a pattern that keeps repeating itself. Feeling like he's losing his mind, he goes to his roof the next morning and looking up at the clear sky, and then his watch, he chuckles at the improbability. Just then, a raindrop lands on his list and the inevitable pattern begins. Returning to his apartment, he walkthroughs the pattern in depth, which ultimately ends in a boom. Later that evening, Dylan goes to the gallery, which is hosting an exhibit of Jonas's art pieces. Sarah is pulled away by Jonas, and Dylan is later introduced to the artist, who reveals a light hologram exhibition of the Grand Central Station. Dylan is in disbelief when he sees that it is exactly like the events that he has experienced the past few days. When Jonas appears next to him, Dylan accuses him of stalking him, as only Dylan has witnessed these events. He attacks Jonas, which results in a fight that lands them on the ground. Getting up to an ovation, the owner of the Kiefer Gallery approaches them and tells him he's impressed that Jonas tied his piece to a reenactment of a murder that happened 30 years ago at the station, which he happens to be exhibiting as well. Sarah, who is mortified, apologizes to Jonas, and pulls Dylan to the side where she tells him she is unable to think clearly and asks him to leave. Later that night, Dylan texts Sarah to apologize, and when she doesn't respond, he returns and sees Jonas and her together. Working out his frustration, while the news reports on the supernova, he stumbles on a packet of hidden letters and belongings in the beams. Going through the documents, he finds a passport belonging to a man named Jake Redman, who previously lived at the exact address. Dylan makes his way to the Kiefer Gallery, and outside, he receives a text from Sarah, just before a water drop lands on his wrist. Inside, he discovers the pattern of events he's experienced in art form, and learns that the artist based his work on an old article reporting on the murder, which mentions the name Jake Redman. Back at home, Dylan digs through old archives online and discovers that Jake was a criminal, who had gunned down his lover, a woman named Evelyn, and a policeman named Noah, in a jealous rage. The murder occurred on April 18, 1986, which was the day both Dylan and Sarah were born. Locating her, Dylan makes a visit to Evelyn's sister, and hands her the packet of letters. She shares that Evelyn had a special effect on men, and that Noah, a policeman who was also in love with her, was taking her to Millhurst to get away from Jake, an alleged criminal. Evelyn believed Jake to be the love of her life, and when Dylan asks her if Jake felt the same, she assumes yes, and that he felt it was better to kill her than to let her go. She shares that Noah visited Evelyn and told her things about Jake that she refused to believe. Jake and Evelyn shared the same birthday, which made Evelyn believe they were destined to be together. Handing him a stack of letters Evelyn received from Jake, she shows him the necklace, which is identical to Sarah's, and says it's all she needs to remember her sister by. Heading back, Dylan sends Sarah a text, telling her the events are all connected and begs her to call him. Meanwhile, Sarah is at the art gallery and is bewildered by Jonas's piece, which depicts Dylan's description of events. Jonas tells her the idea came to him well before she ever met Dylan, and tries to convince her that Dylan is dangerous. Arriving at the station, Dylan tries to buy a ticket to Millhurst but is told that the service was terminated 30 years ago and now goes to Poughkeepsie. At exactly 2:22 p.m., the chandelier crashes to the floor. Now at home, Sarah drops by, and reunited they share an urgent kiss. Elsewhere, Jonas is at his studio, and it is obvious that he is not over Sarah. Back at Dylan's, Sarah is disturbed by what she sees, as Dylan connects the dots, and shares his belief that Dylan was Jake, while Sarah was Evelyn in their past lives. When he tries to show the letters to her, she discards them and tries to get him to snap out of his paranoid state by telling them they're coincidences. Dylan is unwavering in his belief and tells her they have to end their relationship, or they will end up dying the next day, on their birthdays, at exactly 2:22 p.m. When she leaves, Dylan works out his rage and contemplates suicide, but is unable to go through with it. Meanwhile, a distraught Sarah shows up at Jonas's studio, and when he tells her he's taking her away to Millhurst for her own safety, she tells him she loves Dylan and believes that they're soulmates, not noticing his pensive look. The next morning, Dylan continues his search to connect the pattern to the present day and finally realizes that he is seeing the events as they play out on the day of his death. Rushing over to Jonas's studio, he breaks in and discovers his obsession with Sarah. Uncovering an empty gun box, he concludes that Jonas is Noah Marks. Meanwhile, Jonas and Sarah are notified that their flight to Millhurst is cancelled and have to take the train instead. Dylan tries to get a hold of Sarah and she follows Jonas's advice and doesn't answer. Unable to reach her, he runs to the station, and on his way, he attracts the attention of the police. At the station, Jonas says he'll get the tickets and will meet her at the clock. Sarah begins to see Dylan's described pattern, and when Dylan finally gets a hold of her, he tells her that the pattern represents the day they die. Jonas appears just then and tells her he got the tickets to Poughkeepsie, and is confused when she asks about Millhurst. Asking if she's ready, Sarah has a sudden revelation and changes her mind, and backs away from him. Jonas becomes enraged and shocks her when he calls her Evelyn, insisting that she loves him. When Dylan calls her name from across the hall, Jonas, who thinks that she called him there, gets infuriated and makes his way to Dylan with a gun. Sarah watches the events unfold as Dylan had described, and realizes that she is the pregnant woman standing under the clock. Jonas first points his gun towards Dylan, telling him Sarah will never be his, and then aims it at Sarah. Dylan shields Sarah just in time but is shot in the process. When the scene circles around, Evelyn and Jake appear just as they were 30 years ago. Returning to the present, the clock strikes 2:22, and 3 shots are fired, killing Jonas. Dylan falls in Sarah's arms and closes his eyes. He relives their time together as well as Jake and Evelyn's moments. When the clock strikes 2:23, they cry tears of joy seeing as they made it past the fateful minute. Dylan narrates that Jake was framed for murdering Noah and Evelyn, as the police had wanted to protect Noah's legacy as a policeman, and that Hamlin, the dying star, finally disappears, and is replaced with a new one. Did you enjoy the movie? Tell us in the comments below, and if you want to watch more, check out the next recap about a man who is unable to escape his destiny and has to make the ultimate sacrifice.